started in June of 1950, the Korean War we're talking about. And I was activated, our unit was activated September 1st of 1950 because I had volunteered for the National Guard. And there was a little bit of, there were two reasons to be in it. Number one, I could make a little extra money in training, but the second reason that I was in the National Guard was that I kind of had a sense of a little bit of protecting the country and so on and so forth. I was what we would call a flag waver today. There was a little bit of a flag waver. So I thought I was doing a good thing. I didn't think about whether it was justified or not. It's kind of like you may, at that particular point in my life, at 19 years old, in which I follow orders, if someone says, my president says we gotta go fight a war, we go fight a war. You're in a period in which we'd just come off of World War II, you didn't question authority. In other words, if someone said we have to go fight a war, if your president says we go fight a war, the government says we go fight a war, you go. You didn't even bother to question why you were fighting. It's just, you have a duty and a job to do. And at that point I was married. So my wife and daughter, of course my daughter was too small, but my wife wasn't too keen about it. It was a very unpopular war. It was a war in which no one knew what we were, as far as they were concerned, they didn't know what we were fighting for, and why should we be over on the other side of the planet fighting a war that no one knew there was a reason for it. Well, that was back in a time before protests. It was not like the Vietnam War, which in the 1970s had a heavy protest. But the 1950 war, the Korean War, in some people's eyes, was nothing but a forgotten war. I mean, it was, no one was paying much attention. 55,000 American troops lost their lives in the Korean War, but no one was paying much attention to the war. It's just that it did not impact that many people. During World War II, we had rationing, we had the whole populace was behind the war, and people were making sacrifices. During the Korean War, the economy was good, things were going great, and people were just not impacted. We had people like Joe McCarthy in Congress that was trying to root out communists everywhere because these were traitors to our country. It was way overdone, way overblown. Communism was not that bad. It just became the ogre, so to speak, that we could direct all of our anger against. In other words, back at that time, it ended up that if something wasn't like you thought it should be, you said, well, it's because it's communistic or something like that. And so it became the bad guys. But we used to have training films that we would watch all the time on how bad communism was. In other words, that the true enemy in the world was communism. And therefore it was our duty to oppose communism. And so I was like anybody else. These are communists that we have to repulse because they're coming into the free world. And if we don't stop them here, they're going to be in our country soon or something like that. One of the things, when I landed in Korea at the port of Incheon, one of the things that struck me immediately was the smell. And of course, you can imagine what it's from. In other words, if you're using human excrement, you see as fertilizers, that just these smells everywhere. It was just not like the United States. It was not like it at all. To see the housing too, were just simple paper shacks in many cases. Yeah, it was so to speak. This is pouring, this is paradise. I would eat fruit that I could pluck off a tree, because it was one of the things that the Koreans used. They used human excrement for their fertilizer. Everything was grown with human excrement. They didn't waste anything. All of this went into the rice paddies and into all that was the fertilizer. At the time when I got to Korea, they didn't really need anybody with my particular qualifications. So as a consequence, I was with the 25th Infantry Division, and we were south of Seoul, Korea, the capital of Korea now, in a little industrial town called Yongdong-po. And Yongdong-po was the division rear for the 25th Infantry Division. And so I just kind of sat around there for about a month or so, something like that, with nothing to do, except that our commanding officer loved to play pinochle. He loved to play, so at night, and he knew I played pinochle, so at night I'd get roped into these games playing pinochle with several of the other officers. Well, the problem is that they would cheat. And I called him on cheating one time, because I said, because we were playing for modest amounts of money, but there was some money involved in the thing, you know, and I'm not a captain, I'm not a colonel, I'm not a major, I'm just a sergeant. And, you know, I can't afford to lose any money. So I called him on it, and immediately the next day I was shipped to the front lines. So that's how I ended up being in the laundry business, is because I called the commanding officer. I said, "You're cheating. It's all for you, buddy. You're gone." I was assigned to the 35th Infantry Regiment. I was with Service Company of the 35th Infantry Regiment, and I was in charge of the laundry for the entire regiment. So I was up on the front line, but not fighting. I was actually in charge of laundry for 3,000 men. There was an old saying, I think it still probably applies, it's called hurry up and wait. In other words, in the military, you're always hurrying up all the time to do something, and then after you get there, then you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait. So, it was nice to be doing something. When you went overseas, you wouldn't be in communication with your family. Except for the occasional box. My wife would send a box of goodies, cookies. There was censorship, but it was not too rigid. Occasionally she'd get a letter that would have some things censored out, but I didn't basically talk too much about where we were or what we were doing. So the toughest conditions for me personally was the cold. It was cold. It was very, very cold. The winter of 1951, as was the winter of 1950, it was just below zero all the time. 20 below, 30 below, 40 below, 50 below zero. Korea is a very mountainous area, and it's very cold. Secondly, we didn't have proper equipment. When the United States entered the war in 1950, there was not enough clothing even that was suited for this kind of cold weather fighting. We did not have insulated boots like people have today and what have you, and frostbite was very, very common in everyone. We didn't have ample sleeping bags. We didn't have down sleeping bags. We had nothing but old wool sleeping bags from World War II and World War I think, in some cases. I could have ended up, I guess, on the front line, but artillery was my forte, and mostly the artillery would not be on the front line. I suppose it always could have been with possibility for some shelling of artillery or something like that I could have gotten caught in the crossfire, so to speak. I had a couple of experiences in which I was taking a convoy from one part of the military sector to another, and we had someone with us who was supposed to know where we were going. We got lost, and we ended up on the front lines, just probably a quarter of a mile from where the front lines were at that point. There were guns going off all around us, and so I finally stopped my convoy and went into one of the military units there, and I said, "Which way to so-and-so?" I said, "We're lost." And he said, "Well, you don't want to keep going that way." We were losing men all the time. And when I would go up to the units, the fighting units themselves, and I'd be up there getting laundry, when I'd go up to the units themselves, you'd see the dead men. They'd be stacked up like cordwood. because it was so cold, and their bodies would be stiff and frozen, and they'd haul them out in trucks. So that's where it came home to me that men were being killed in the process. I entered Korea in late summer of 1951 and in March of 1952. So I was in Korea about 6 months, I guess, something like that. They got a call, or they needed some troops back in Japan. And so they asked who wants to volunteer to go back to Japan. Actually, I'm one of the first. My hand goes up. So I went back to Japan at that point, and I became sergeant major of an actually entire division. The Korean War was an unwinnable war. I don't think you should be in any war that you can't win. The only way you win a war is to occupy land, and to occupy land takes a lot of men and takes a lot of people killed. And we couldn't win the Korean War. We couldn't have won the Vietnam War. We didn't really win the Iraq War, despite what we say. And we ought to get out of Afghanistan.